Welcome everyone. Hopefully you all have your lunches. If you can find a seat, we want to get started because we have a great conversation. My name's Adva Saldinger. I'm an associate editor at DevEx, and I'm really excited to welcome you all here today for a great conversation about innovations for smallholder farmers. So I'll give you a few minutes to quiet down. All right. So to give us some introductory remarks, I wanted to welcome Peter Haas, who's the Senior Advisor and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy and Negotiations in the Bureau of Economic Affairs at the State Department. So Peter, please join us.
Good morning, and thank you very much to CropLife for inviting me to come here and to provide opening remarks for this discussion. You know, while the headlines often focus on war and peace, many of the most serious challenges that we face as a global community are really economic in nature, including income inequality, poverty, a lack of opportunity. And we sometimes overlook the fact that many of the world's conflicts are founded or based on or caused by these exact same economic issues. And in many parts of the world, these fundamental issues stem from unaddressed hurdles in the agricultural sector. So globally, 815 million people are food insecure, and 75% of poor people in developing countries live in rural areas. Growth in the agricultural sector has been found on average to be at least twice as effective in reducing poverty when compared to growth in other sectors. And so the fundamental importance of agriculture in combating poverty and in reducing inequality and increasing national security cannot be overstated. So as many of you know from firsthand experience, the farmers responsible for our food supply face extraordinary odds. Unpredictable weather patterns, continually evolving pressures from diseases and pests, and increasing demand from a growing global population whose preferences are constantly changing. So if farmers are to deal with these complex issues, they need a diversity of solution and they need access to new technologies. A one-size-fits-all approach simply won't work. Luckily for all of us, farmers are great innovators. They're constantly improving what will work for them on their farm, testing new approaches and technologies, and collecting information that they will use during the next growing season. And then they repeat that process year after year, constantly improving what they do. It shouldn't be surprising that the goal of today's event is to connect two important groups in this process, the farmers and the scientists, so that they can discuss the problems facing agriculture. In many cases, the innovative solutions already exist. They're just not being used. At the State Department, we work with our embassies abroad throughout the world to promote technology that has not yet achieved its full potential, and that's agricultural biotechnology. As all of you know, agricultural biotechnology isn't new. It's been around for over 20 years. And in that time, biotech crops have greatly improved efficiency and production in the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. You probably know these statistics, but on average, biotech has increased crop yields by 22%, reduced total chemical pesticide use by 37%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. And biotechnology obviously has advantages over conventional breeding. It delivers traits that have not yet evolved in nature, such as virus resistance in papaya. It can speed crop improvement, adding desirable traits like disease resistance into potatoes that could otherwise take years and years to develop using traditional breeding methods. So what we know is that biotechnology can work for farmers worldwide. Of the 18 million farmers growing biotech crops in 2016, 90% of those were smallholder subsistence farmers in developing countries. Using insect-resistant biotech eggplant, Bangladeshi farmers have reduced pesticide use from 80 sprays per season to less than 2. Using insect-resistant biotech cotton, India has become the world's leading exporter of cotton. But despite these successes, only 26 countries worldwide grow biotech crops. Only 3 countries on the entire African continent have access to biotechnology. And so you ask yourself, how does a 20-year-old technology still sit on the shelf and not be utilized? So a lack of scientific infrastructure, confusion about how to perform science-based risk assessment of new technologies, political motives, personal beliefs, all of these continue to prevent innovative approaches to biotechnology and to keep them from reaching the farmers that need them most. Unfortunately, perception often drives policy. So in order for biotech crops to be successful, both farmers and politicians must be open to trying new innovative technologies, and scientists and policymakers need to be better communicators about these technologies. At the State Department, we work on a global scale to try and reshape conversations about biotechnology and to focus on the benefits to farmers. So as evidence, in Vietnam, we've spent over 10 years of outreach in collaboration with industry and the USDA to help Vietnam streamline their pipeline for biotech crop imports. And we hope and we're expecting that that will speed U.S. exports to Vietnam. In Turkey and our outreach through our embassy there, we've helped overturn Turkish regulatory restrictions, and we've increased U.S. exports of biotech crops to Turkey by $500 million. And so we at the State Department are optimistic that the challenges facing agriculture can be overcome. And so with that, I've described a little bit about why the State Department views this as being so important to both global food security and to U.S. national security. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Julie Borlaug. She's the Vice President of Communications and PR for Inari Agriculture. She works to champion her grandfather's legacy and to lend a voice to his desire to see a more successful collaborative partnerships between public and private sectors in order to ensure the advancement of innovation and technology in agriculture. She's very modest. She told me not to read her entire bio and then just move really quickly to saying that she's all about promoting the Borlaug legacy, the need for research and technology, and it's my privilege to welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
I am on. If I walk off the stage, it's only going to be typical that I would do that. So I want to thank CropLife International and Howard and then DevEx for having me. Howard, somehow I haven't offended you yet, so you keep having me come back, so thank you. I always like to start with the farmers. How many farmers do we have in the room? On behalf of my grandfather and everyone who eats, thank you for what you do, your dedication, and we are here because of you. When I talk about why I care, I'm not going to go through the challenges. We all know the challenges, but why do I care about agriculture? And you can see from this slide, this boy is 13. He is stunted. We all know what stunting does. And he is in kindergarten. 1 out of every 4 children is stunted across the world. And when you think about what that is going to do as our population grows, it is an incredible burden, and a burden we don't have to have. And that is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about agriculture. I also come to it genetically, maybe a GMO from my grandfather, but it's helping young children and then also the smallholder farmer. My grandfather's legacy, many of you know about, but what was most important to him were the smallholder farmers. His last words were, "Take it to the farmer." When he was told he was dying from cancer, he told the doctor he needed 5 more years for Africa, that he had failed Africa. So the smallholder farmer was with him from the beginning to the end, and it really was the last thing on his mind. But if you look at my grandfather's legacy, you have to look at 3 barriers, and this is in his Nobel Peace Prize speech. And he said in 1970 there are 3 barriers in agriculture: the technological, the psychological, and the economic. And those still stand today. And if you want to go to the next slide. And when he said the psychological, that was about getting people young farmers and researchers willing to make a change and use new systems and accept new technologies. When I talk about psychological and I'm more about communication, we still have that problem today. We have a group of people who fear everything we're doing in technology. And why it's so important about this, and you want to go to the next slide, is we have all these new challenges in agriculture, and they all have unintended, all of the challenges we face. We have moms who are now in charge of food and where our priorities and our regulatories. We have food bloggers. We have yoga instructors who are giving nutrition advice online. They have probably a degree from online, and people actually believe them. And that affects everything we do. If you want to go to the next slide. But the most important thing is it affects her, and it affects the smallholder farmers. People don't realize the unintended consequences of their choices or their anti-backlash of what that does to the farmers. We do have a whole new fact-resistant human race who doesn't seem to like to talk about technology or hear about science. So when I do go and speak, I speak about the smallholder farmer. I speak about her realities. And this is her organic farm. She doesn't have soil nutrition. It's been depleted. She doesn't have any modern tools. And the one thing she probably, or two things she probably would need most are good seed varieties and fertilizer. Yet this reality of what a smallholder farmer's life is, in the West, if you go to the next slide, this is what everyone thinks a smallholder farmer in Africa is doing. It's a lovely backyard. They're just with their chickens and they're picking, tomatoes, and everything is easy. And we have a crisis with that and how we're going to change that, because the technologies and innovations we have currently should be with the smallholder farmer. And if you think about, my grandfather always said there's no technology too advanced for a smallholder farmer. And that's still true today. Did we put landlines in Africa or India or any of the other developing countries? No. They leapfrogged into mobile phones. And if you want to go to the next slide. So when you talk about technology and what it's going to do for the smallholder farmer, this is more of the genetic slide. But you think about mobile phone technology, how farmers have insurance, they have access to market information, they have access to banking. Everyone knows what M-Pesa has done for Kenya. And they have so many other things that are coming out, but we can't block them. And if you talk about my grandfather's, probably what he wanted to see a brown revolution with soil, and he wanted to see a gene revolution. So we are at the gene revolution. We have a lot going in genetic editing, or genome editing, and many other things. My company is working in precision breeding or gene editing, and it's exciting to see. But we have to make sure these new technologies that will provide drought-tolerant varieties and many other things are not held up because we don't have a social license or social acceptance to get this and many other technologies to the farmer. Does anyone know Digital Green here? If you haven't, Google Digital Green. It is one of my favorite. Ripken, who is the founder, he's a 32-year-old rock star is what I call him. But he essentially is redoing extension for developing countries. We know we can't get an extension agent out or have a system that we have here in the United States that made us what we are today. But he's brought the mobile phone technology and extension videos that can go from farmer to farmer. They're also collecting data so the farmers can have market information. And one of just the simple things that changed in one village was that if you left the flour on the squash, they were tracking data on prices, you got a better fee. So it's small technologies like that that really make a difference. And I think that's where we are with the future of ag, and I think it's exciting, but again, everything has to get to the smallholder farmer, and you can go to the next slide. But before I end, we also have to talk about the next generation. That's my little generation. And that's actually in my grandfather's wheat fields in Obregon. So he's been to different CGs, he's been to Africa, and he's been to Mexico. So I'm breeding him to become the next Borlaug scientist. But we have to use our youth. And the great thing about youth is they're open to technology, and they're interested in going back into farming. I shouldn't even be giving this speech right now because we have Dr. Emma, a phenomenal smallholder farmer. You'll get to hear from her later, who has revolutionized what you can do on 1 acre, and she teaches other people. She has her own fodder system It's in Uganda. It is phenomenal. So there's so many great stories. But again, when we're communicating, let's talk about the realities of a smallholder farmer. Let's talk about what Dr. Emma goes through and what she teaches other farmers so we get those outside to really understand why technology and innovation can't sit on a shelf, can't be held up in regulatory, or can't be held up in a PR crisis, because you can't be anti-hunger and anti-innovation. This is all my information if you ever want to get to me, and thank you so much. I'm going back up.
Thank you, Julie. I'm now going to welcome our panel up onto the stage with me. So Julie's going to be joining us for the panel. And I'd like to welcome Jim Gaffney, who's the Global Regulatory Strategy Lead at DuPont Pioneer, Vimlenda Sharan from the Food and Agriculture Organization, Motlatsi Mutsi, who's a farmer from South Africa, and Rob Bertram, who's the Chief Scientist at USAID's Bureau for Food Security.
We need one more chair.
Are we short of
do you
chair?
want me to stand?
I can stand. Go for it. Yeah.
Don't encourage me.
Why didn't you put one of those chairs in there?
It's fine. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. I did also want to shout out and say hello to folks who are joining us via the live streaming. And also encourage you all to join the conversation online with hashtag FoodPrize17. So I wanted to kick us off with a question for you, Jim, as our private sector representative. And I think, as we talk about innovation for the smallholder farmer, one of the questions that's essential is, are you thinking about smallholder farmers as you're doing R&D? How are you incorporating them into some of those processes and innovation pipelines within your company and sort of across the private sector?
Yeah, so thank you, Adva, for that question. Because yes, part of the success of Pioneer and DuPont Pioneer, now Dow DuPont going forward, is the fact that we have over a 90-year history of thinking of the farmer. Back in the 1920s, when our company was formed here in North America, we were thinking about the farmer. That's why our hybrids were successful. Now, we have seed sales in over 90 countries around the world. If we do not have that farmer in mind, and even the end user that farmer sells to, we will be out of business. So everything we do as we develop our products, as we develop our hybrids, as we work on gene editing and our biotech traits, we are thinking of the end user and the farmer customer. So it can be very complicated in some areas, but yes, it's part of what we do. It's part of our history.
And Rob, I wanted to bring you in because you're looking at how do we do research that's going to really, turn the tide on some of these issues. And I think that sort of connected to that, how do we, ensure that the research that we're doing, one, reflects the voice of smallholder farmers and is actually getting to the innovations that they need?
Well, thanks, Edva, and it's a pleasure to be here. So really, when we set out to fund research with our partners, we have to think about that impact pathway and who it will ultimately benefit, and generally that's smallholder farmers. And so we start by building a social science component, a robust social science component into all of our commodity or other research programs. And that can start at talking to farmers about what traits they prioritize, what kind of beans women want to, in the colors that they want, the cooking times that they require, and so forth. And all of that feeds back in. And then as we move through commodity development, we can do participatory variety selection with, again, bringing farmers into the crop improvement process. But then we also have what we call sustainable intensification as a major thrust of our research. And that's where you put all the technologies together in the context of the human capital, the natural resource endowment, the market and policy context. And there, for example, we have a program called Africa Rising that has 10,000 smallholder farmer partners. And they are active partners in doing on-farm research. And so we build this feedback loop in all along. And I think we have good examples of how, that ends up leading our research and innovation investments towards outcomes that will really be used.
Do you want to share one of those examples with us? And what are some of the challenges then in ensuring that that is sort of driving the direction of
So I think the bean story is a really good one in terms of the cooking quality, the cooking time, especially at high elevations. That becomes a very serious factor. And we have, by working with farmers in our grain legume innovation lab and in our partners at CIAT and the CGIAR and the national programs, develop beans that specifically respond to the cooking time needs, and they are adopted. I mean, people like them. They also have disease resistance and high yielding and all those other good things, but you really do have to know who your market is for the technology and that will eventually make it successful. So that's one example. There are others.
Yeah. Mutlatsi, I wanted to bring you in on this point because you're sort of our farmer representative on this panel. And I think to build on what Rob was saying, I think that often you have to identify the key need for the smallholder farmer and figure out how to devise products to that end. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what, for you personally, for other farmers that you know on the continent, what are the innovations that you need the most?
Thanks for having me. We need modern technologies because our environment changed. We need to adapt to this changed environment. In my country, for instance, we are planting for the first time this year the drought-tolerant seed because what we are experiencing there is droughts and floods. So we'll need more and more modern ones that will suit our environments. Some of our farmers are happy with the Roundup Ready seed because instead of standing with a hoe in the fields, we spray Roundup. In a few minutes, the women have got a chance to go and look after their children. Others want them both because like one with BT for pest resistance as well as herbicide tolerance because we do have the pest as well. So yeah, it's an ongoing innovation and thanks for my country, South Africa, for allowing the GM technology into my country. It is working for us.
Vimlendra, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. At the FAO, one of the things you've really done is try to put an emphasis on smallholder farmer livelihoods. And yes, that deals with better seed varieties, better technology, and access to those things. But it's also about changing systems. And changing systems in a way that not only enable farmers to have links into markets, but also to have better access to those new technologies. So tell us a little bit about why the FAO has taken this approach and how can systems or process innovations and not just the product innovations help to transform the lives of smallholder farmers?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here and giving me the stage to share these thoughts. Now, let me just kick off with a couple of figures which are very important to just put in perspective why we in FAO feel that smallholder farmers are at the core of any development that needs to be really done for farming sector as a whole. So it's known that by 2050 you have 9 to 10 billion people inhabiting this earth. It's also known that you'll be needing about 50% more food grain than what you have today to feed this population. And it is expected that the smallholder farmer, which is about 500 million small farms, will be providing the bulk. While we're expecting all this, we tend to forget that these smallholder farmers are facing huge barriers. These are technological barriers, these are financial barriers, these are processes, these are regulatory barriers, these are access barriers. And unless we change, our expectations will not be met. And for any change to come about, innovation has to happen. So when I was listening to all this about technology, the thought which came to my mind was that, it's not always products which are required. It's not always a new seed which is required. It's not always a GMO introduction which is required. There's a lot of technology available. It's also necessary to innovate in processes. It's also necessary to expand use of existing technologies. And in that context, we have to understand that innovations normally would take two pathways, either introduction of new technologies, or the second pathway would be absorbing and expanding on the use of existing technologies. While the first pathway increases the potential to deliver, the second pathway makes the farmer more adept in using the potential already developed. So both these approaches are extremely important. And we in FAO definitely, while promoting new technologies, definitely, we also would like to promote new farming methodologies, adapting those, and also help the government to come out with new regulations to ensure that the barriers which are coming in way of small farmers really contributing in a bigger way, to break those barriers down. I was just discussing with Dr. Swaminathan. She heads the Swaminathan Fund in Chennai, and they have come out with a great book on stories of farmers all around. And she told me we were discussing about yield gaps and labor productivity gaps. So unless the small farmers' yield gaps and labor productivity gaps are reduced by using innovative methods, there is no way we are going to see success in this. And that's why FAO is absolutely clear that smallholder farmer will have to be at the core of any innovative exercise that we do.
So this is, I think this challenge of adoption of behavior change is obviously what I think often if you make the case or you start with the need of the farmer, you can get there more easily. But Julie, you're a professional in this sort of communication space, right? And know a lot about farming. So I guess one question I have for you is as you look at sort of that piece, at the systemic piece about the adoption piece, what can we do to help? What are some sort of concrete steps that we can take to help get from the innovation and get that innovation into the smallholder farmers and get that widespread adoption, not just a few thousand farmers in a pilot in one country, but trying to across swaths of land? One thing that President Adesina said earlier is that, how do we look across borders, right? So regions, in terms of the types of seed varieties, et cetera, that may work aren't confined to the borders of one country. So how do we look sort of more broadly and get that sort of adoption?
Well, in terms of communication, is anyone in this room from outside agriculture? What industry? That doesn't, no, that doesn't count. You understand our lingo. So my point is, here we are sitting and talking about things we all know about and talk about a lot. If we want to change our communication and change the barriers of getting technology movement forward, we have to change the audience we're talking to. We need to be out speaking to so many different audiences, and we need everyone here. We need the medical community here. We need nutrition. We need life sciences. We need the engineering. So that's pretty much one of a very basic, simple, but also it's our messaging. We're still using the same language. I know we're all trying to change that, but we're still only talking to ourselves. Nobody from the anti-side or purely organic is going to come to any of our websites or pick up any of our information and walk away and feel changed. So I'm sorry, I'm being a little like my grandfather, a little brutal, but if we don't change that, we're not going to make a change. In my new position, I'm not a scientist, but I talk a lot. So my goal is to revolutionize how we communicate about agriculture. We at Inari hope that we never sound like anyone else, that you could just put all of our websites up and we're all, it is true. You put all of our websites up right now, it's all the same thing. We want to communicate completely differently and in a radical way. We know we have to talk to our farmers, we know we have to talk to the regulators, we know investors, and we also know we have to have a social license to continue what we're doing. So everything we do needs to start with the consumer or the public. And I think until we do that and tell our stories differently, we're not going to get what the smallholders truly need. And if we could take more people over to see the lives of smallholders, that would be great. But instead of me talking about the life of a smallholder farmer, let's get the smallholder farmer up here talking to a completely different audience and explaining what her life is and why technology is so important. We have to take people out of their comfort zone. I think we've proven in the United States, this is a sad fact, no one cares that we are saying we're going to feed the world, because in the US, food grows in grocery stores, so there's never been a shortage. So we have to just look very differently, talk very differently, because we have 25,000 people who are dying today of malnourishment. We have smallholder farmers who are pleading for technology. We have it here. The only way we're going to get it there is if we change how we engage.
We just wanted to add to this communication bit that we found that, more than any report, if you take success stories to people, that is one of the best communication channels. So people and farmers really get inspired by others who have done well. So I'll give you just one small example about farmers in Burkina Faso, where FAO worked with them on introducing microdosing and linking it with Warantage. And the production increased sorghum and millet by more than 60%. The farmers' incomes increased. And that got adopted in Niger without any major intervention strategy. So it's the success stories which really communicate, and I think that is one thing which, if we can take to farmers and take to countries, that would really help. And there are ample of success stories around the world.
So, we talked about farmers wanting things, but I think when we think about being demand-driven, we also have to think about markets. So a nice example of that, which has revolutionized the lives of some people in East Africa, is around pigeon pea, where the introduction of a bold-seeded type, light-colored, which was highly desired in the Indian market, allowed smallholders in Tanzania and Mozambique to greatly increase their both their investment, but then their prices and the demand, the market linkages. And it's been a fantastic story. ICRISAT's been in the middle of it, one of the CGIAR partners, also national partners. I think one of the challenges we still have is how to convince people to eat some of the pigeon peas at home around better nutrition and don't just sell them all because they fetch a good price. Another way to do this too is around partnerships. And I want to call out, I hadn't thought about this before, Jim, but we have a partnership with Pioneer and Purdue University, CIMMYT, and I think a dozen at least seed companies in South Asia and all 4 NARs in the region. And it's around heat-tolerant maize. And Mothlotzi, you mentioned the changes that are occurring. And so heat issues in South Asia are really significant. And so they've built in this full length of innovation to seed marketing. So you've tried to build that in. But coming back to that first point, Adva, they have also brought women farmers in and using really advanced breeding techniques, genomic-based selection. They have done in 3 years what used to take 10. And they have developed varieties, and the women have very specific preferences about what they want, these farmers. So there's various ways we get at this, and we do have to think about the innovation pathway, but also what happens post-farm and the demand there.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to thank you, sir, for introducing that pigeon pea. What I like about what you said is that the farmers are now selling this good quality.
Yeah.
See, farming shouldn't be a subsistent occupation. It can be a sustainable profession. Given the right tools, such as what you did, what happened to us in South Africa, we're making profits. Thank you.
So 2 other questions for you, actually, Mothlotzi. One is about this communication piece. So you're a farmer. What gets you to change the type of product you use, right? So what do you think helps convince smallholder farmers to adopt a new technology or to change their way they're doing certain things?
what makes them change is what they experience. For instance, this year's planting season, okay, the maize that we are harvesting, because we are now into another planting season that we planted last year. I'm in my 60s, and it was for the first time that I saw this pest called armyworm, which destroyed our crops. So people who planted BT maize survived, and the neighbor with open pollinated varieties fed the armyworm. So because of that experience, the farmer wanted the better quality that is secured.
And one of the things that Julie mentioned is the next generation. And I know that you're active in your community also to teach farming to some youth.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and sort of why you think it's important to encourage the next generation. What some of the challenges are around trying to get them engaged in farming?
Firstly, I think if I don't take the technology, the next generation will blame it on me. So I took it and I teach the people. I am a first-generation farmer. Around us, other nations are the fifth and more. I'm the first one. And with farming being generational and profitable, I don't want to say one day when I put a betting down, I must leave my children with the technology that failed me. So I go around and even teach them. Have I answered you?
Yes. Did you want to jump in, Jim?
So
I'm scribbling away.
The question here about what drives behavior. There's a somewhat, what I see as a condescending attitude towards smallholder farmers. And Julie's talked a little bit about the subsistence farmers being romanticized and smallholder farmers being romanticized for being organic and being subsistence. There's nothing romantic about it. So the other part of my story is my wife is from southern Cameroon. So she's from a village there. We go back and visit. They are still subsistence farmers. But they are good farmers. They're excellent risk managers because they don't have too many options available to them, so they really rely on themselves. And when the opportunity arises, they respond to market signals. If there is a transparent market available, if there is a fair price for their excess production, they will react. They don't want to be subsistence any more than anybody else. They want to climb that prosperity ladder. We have to give them the tools to do it, both on the input side and give them a fair price on the market side. I know in southern Cameroon, there are population centers where the price of things like plantains and cassava are very high. Yet, in the village, there's really no way to make that connection to the smallholder farmers in some cases, so they produce just enough for themselves, and they do not get to participate in these high prices. We've got to do better on that side.
Yeah, Wim, I wonder if you could, on this piece of market linkages, because as we're looking at improving the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, that's obviously a really important piece to have markets to sell some of these crops into. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how FAO is looking at that piece, and I think that that's a place where also sort of partnership with the private sector is probably a smart opportunity.
It's absolutely imperative. You see, any innovation comes with a risk, and no farmer is going to take to any innovation unless there is some guarantee of a return. A guarantee of the return can come only from the market. And there are huge barriers, again, as far as smallholders are concerned, there are barriers connecting a smallholder farmer to, say, even to a local market and definitely to a regional, national, international market. And those barriers need to be broken. It is necessary to ensure that in this whole value chain, the smallholder farmer does not get, sidelined because big companies come to occupy a large space. So that needs to be balanced, and national governments therefore need to play a very important role there to ensure that the smallholder farmer is not left out of this growth story. I don't think there will be anyone in this room or anywhere in this world who will deny the importance of linking a farmer to the market if you want to take him out of simple subsistence where he grows for himself. So if he has to take to farming as a business, which he must, because there has to be a return, and there has to be a good market available for the products that he makes.
So how do you drive innovation around those systems, around the systems of market linkages? Because that's, I mean, that piece requires innovation as well.
Absolutely. So you have to provide multiple platforms. Firstly, there's a huge information gap. So I'm sitting in a small village in North Bihar in India. I have absolutely no clue what my farm product is going to fetch me if I travel just to the state capital. So I'm totally reliant on the middleman who comes to my farm gate and tells me that your farm produce is worth so much and that is what it gives me. Now that perhaps is not even, that perhaps is not even meeting the cost of production or just about meeting the cost of production. So the information gap which is coming in has to be dealt with, and technology has a big role to play there. Mobiles have a big role to play there. This warrantage system which I just spoke about, where warehouse receipts become a tradable commodity. So I produce, but I don't have to sell today immediately. A third party holds the grains for me, and the receipts that I get is what I use as a collateral to raise money. So you have to come out with more new innovative products which can help a smallholder get linked to the market in an effective way, where he's not cheated out of the sweat and the blood that he has really put into coming with his products. A similar story, in a way, holds true for linking him to international trade, which really is not, even today, at least today, is not really catering to the smallholder farmer. Now, there have been stories, success stories. There have been policies in place where you have quarantine issues with, fresh products. So a mango may not be accepted as a export from a country into America, but a mango pulp gets accepted. So how do you link a smallholder farmer, growing mangoes to the international trade in mango pulp? Now, these are the various pathways that you've got to establish. And FAO really has to work and is working with national governments in different contexts, because every country and every region is different. The requirements are different. So we work with national governments to contextualize, see what is best suited to those countries to help small farmers mitigate their risks by getting better returns from the market for their products.
So maybe I'll just add a little bit to that. So what can we do here? So it's about transparent markets. Another great risk management tool is storage. I think in the U.S. farmers have grain bins and they store their maize and soybeans indefinitely. It's a great risk management tool. That's not always easy in the tropics for any crop. For a crop like cassava, that's almost impossible. Once you pull cassava out of the ground, you have to do something with it within 24 hours. But the next risk management tool there might be a value-added product. Chip it, dry it, mill it. You have a valuable product that will store indefinitely. These are the types of things that I think can really help create this next level of prosperity. So it's not just about the technology inputs. It's about, like you mentioned, the system and creating risk management tools for those farmers.
Brock, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add, sometimes I like to think about part of our task being, how do we find smallholder-friendly ways to capitalize what are essentially very undercapitalized systems? So Jim, you just mentioned storage. We could think about mechanization. We could think about irrigation. All of these are capital investments that bring with them risks. So how can we spread those risks and make them smallholder friendly? And I think one of the real exciting opportunities is this whole realm of service provision, which is very attractive to young people. It's attractive to investors because it also reduces their risk. But I think, and maybe Melodzi can comment on this, I think one of the key things that needs to happen for that to be a smallholder-friendly approach is that you need to have markets, both input and output markets of a certain size. So that to the extent that farmers can aggregate their demand by working together around supplying the market or purchasing inputs, that's an incentive to the private sector to make that last mile, to get to them. So we're very interested in a lot of innovative approaches that are occurring that are finding ways to bring these improvements, which raise productivity, reduce risk, and they also reduce drudgery for women especially, which is a huge issue. We talked about this romanticization that occurs, and it's a very hard life. And so I really hope that all of us can be thinking about ways to get at this smallholder-friendly transformation approach.
Yes, me and my farmers do have even a market. Because of the good quality we have in the raw processors, about 3 kilometers away from my farm is where I'm selling my produce. I don't need even to store. I load on my tractor. Some of my farmers come to mail their own for consumption in the house, but they keep some to sell so they can have cash to hire my tractors the following planting season.
Great. One thing that's come up a couple of times is the issue of regulation. And so I wanted to throw this open to all of you. What sort of regulations do we need to unleash the types of both product and systems innovations? Obviously, it's a big question. It's going to be different in each individual country context. But what are sort of the roles of different international actors, of country governments, in sort of making this change? How can you get farmers together to advocate for policies that are going to better help and allow smallholder farmers to have that growth? So I'll give you that question, and just as a heads up, after this question, we're going to go to audience questions. So take this time to think of your question.
So I'll start. In industry, what we ask for and all we ask for is objective, science-based, evidence-based regulation. If something has been demonstrated to be safe 1,000 times before, we can probably lower the regulatory hurdles for that product, because for the next 1,000 times, it'll probably still be safe. I think we know what's safe. Our technologies are safe. We do enormous number of studies to demonstrate safety, both to humans and the environment. So we want science-based, evidence-based, objective rulemaking. And then the second part of that is some semblance of harmonization across borders. Right now, the global regulatory framework is such that each country has their own little way of doing things. Each country asks for their own little study. Each country has their own timelines. And some countries say, well, until you're registered in this country with this product that's been used, we're not even going to start the process in our country. It makes it very unpredictable and very expensive to bring these technologies to farmers anywhere, much less smallholder farmers. So objectivity, science-based, harmonization.
Can I just add 2 more phrases to objective and science-based? Just fair and transparent.
Amen.
So let it be fair for everyone, fair for the big business, fair for the small farmer. So if we have fair and transparent regulatory systems which are consistent, I think that would really help.
So what's the role of the FAO in helping countries develop those
Okay.
policies?
I'll be a
We don't
bit.
have enough time.
I'll be a diplomat here. Now we are working with sovereign governments, but at the end of the day, a regulatory regime in any government is their sovereign right. So we cannot, even if we feel very strongly about certain regulatory regimes existing in certain countries, even if we feel very strongly, we do not try to impose our views. We have to handhold them through a process, and that process does take some time, to convince them about changing certain policies, which we feel, if they do, will help not only their farmers in general, but the whole region in particular. So I'll be very honest here that it's not our mandate to sit over any sovereign national government. Our mandate is to work with them, and that's what we do.
What's Leslie?
As a farmer, I think the regulators need to be taught. But again, they have come to my farm on a fact-finding mission for more than 10 years. Now, if you see an MP coming to your farm for 5 years on a fact-finding mission, how long is he in that portfolio? On the 6th year, somebody else from this very same parliament coming on a fact-finding mission. They end up going on pension, having not delivered. I think what needs to happen is to deregulate. Go back and deregulate the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. Allow the farmers to have the tools that they need. If I give my neighbor the seed because he saw me excel and profitable, and he's going to plant across the border, we are criminals. Can you remove that? We're trying to save you, have enough food for you, the people in the cities. But if I give a farmer in your country a remedy for your country, I'm a criminal. We need to deregulate. Allow farmers to have this tool.
So we've heard, Adva, that science-based policy matters, but regular agriculture and trade policy matter tremendously as well. So remember the situation in Bangladesh where they had a very large tax on imported pumps from Thailand or India or China, I'm not sure from where. And they took that tax off, and all of a sudden, northern Bangladesh transformed from growing one crop a year to growing 2 or even 3 crops a year because there was sustainable irrigation available to farmers by virtue of being able to access these pumps at an affordable price. This had a tremendous impact on human outcomes, on livelihoods, on well-being. And it's a great story that shows that policy, when it's freed up, when the private sector, including farmers, are freed up, they can really respond, and the supply industry and so forth. I would push it one step further, too, and we know that in policy in Africa, a lot of the expenditure of our partner countries goes to subsidies. Well, subsidies are popular here in the United States. But nevertheless, what if some of those resources went into infrastructure that connected farmers to markets more readily, that allowed for market efficiency gains, which is a huge part of productivity gains. The consumers benefits, producers benefit. So there's some really important, challenging policy questions, and we work with FAO and with our university partners and IFPRI and the CGIAR and partners in Africa, the African Union and countries themselves to have this kind of policy dialogue, because policy, along with technology and information, matters.
Great. All right, well now we'll open it up. What we're going to do is we're going to take a couple questions at a time and then throw it back to the panelists. We unfortunately don't have a ton of time for questions. If when you ask your question, you can introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and ask a question. We'd appreciate it. And there's a mic that's going to be coming around. So why don't we start on that side of the room, and we'll make our way this way.
Good morning. My name is John Magnay. I'm the head of agriculture for Opportunity International. We're a network of banks and microfinance institutions in Africa providing finance to smallholder farmers. I live in Uganda, and I've lived there for 40 years. I think my challenge has been that your opening statement was that only 3 out of the 54 African countries have accepted BT crops. 2 weeks ago, the Uganda government passed the BT into law. So I think that's probably the first of the wave. However, it's still going to be a challenge to us because we are actually an exporter of basic food crops. And currently, the surrounding countries do not have BT regulations, and therefore we're now going to have a system where they will have to identify which crops we can export to the region and which ones we can't. So I'd like to hear from the panel how we think it's going to move forward, so that we'll be talking about 3 countries in Africa which don't have BT regulations, so that the rest of us can trade with it.
Great. Can we come here?
Hello, my name is Phil Villas. I'm president of GrainPro, which works in 114 countries on safe, airtight storage without pesticides. My question is this. We've had a very worthwhile discussion on how to increase productivity, which in fact was Norm Borlaug's original contribution. The Green Revolution really was seeds and fertilizers. But as we all know, between production and consumption lies storage. That's the neglected part of the food chain. And although we work in 114 countries, I would not care to name how many have reached what would be decisive stage. And be interested in your comments as to why the concept of improving agriculture so often stops at production, forgetting the stage between production and consumption.
Great. And then we'll go right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Hemant. I'm the project director for Cassava Seed Systems project in Nigeria. And I will add to this gentleman's gaps in thinking. I would like to understand your opinion on that. Vimalendra just reminded us about 500 million farming families. And we spoke about bringing them up through everything like access to markets or inputs or various things. But 2 gaps that I see are not being addressed, at least I see a gap in that area. One is, for each country, what is the ideal proportion of farmers as a whole population? Let some people get out of farming and go off farm, but I don't see a discussion on that lines. And the second one is, we have worked on everything outside the farmer, but inside the farmer's head, I think there is a gap there. And I've worked with tribals, I work with small farmers in India, East Africa, West Africa. But I see there is a problem of hope. A lot of people have lost hope, ambition, and financial literacy is a major gap in the inside of individual farmers. So what are we trying to do on those lines? Thank you.
Great. So we've got 3 questions. One was on the regulation. One was about storage and thinking beyond productivity. And another was about sort of how do we think about some of the other gaps, the number of farmers that we need in proportion to population, and filling some of the farmer knowledge gaps. Anyone want to jump in? Jim?
So we can start with the export market piece. So that is absolutely critical, and that's something that industry globally, it's a fight that we continue to fight. I do see some signs of hope in Africa. The COMESA countries, from Ethiopia down to South Africa, have signed an agreement on seed harmonization. So seed harmonization laws. So that's a huge step for them. Now, I would say they probably haven't implemented all the same, but at least they're thinking alike, and there is a mechanism there for everybody to get together and think about these things and actually try to do something about it. I see the same thing moving that direction eventually for the biotech traits, because the countries I see, like with Uganda, a bit of a thaw there. I don't think some countries are going to want to be left behind. So I think that's going to be helpful. Storage, we're right there with you. It's a huge risk management tool for these farmers. It can be so meaningful. But again, part of the missing gap there is the market signals. If a farmer is not rewarded for storing his grain, why would that farmer invest in grain? So we have to create that piece where the markets signal to that farmer. It's like, well, if you can save your grain or your production, your whatever it is, until the price gets a little higher, and you get a fair price at that point, that would mean all the difference in the world. Storage will happen. We've seen it. Ethiopia is a good example, where they've increased their maize production, and at the same time, they're building storage. It can happen.
Just to expand on storage, and I'm going to take it to infrastructure. Part of the Green Revolution, the reason why it was successful is my grandfather made some demands of the governments. If you're going to use my system, you're going to provide irrigation, you're going to provide fertilizer, you're going to provide storage, and you're going to provide roads. And that's part of why it was so successful. If you look at other countries, we all know how few roads, how few areas are irrigated, and it stops with the government. And unfortunately, until we get the governments willing to invest into infrastructure, we're going to have these problems. If you, just a success story, the Borlaug Institute at Texas A&M with USAID and many in-country partners in Rwanda were successful. It was a 10-year project, I think $12 million, and it's what made the coffee industry in Rwanda so successful. It started with forming cooperatives, teaching them to grow, all the way to market access. However, we were such great partners, all of us, but I will say the one thing that made the difference was Agnes Kalibata was the Minister of Agriculture. If we could duplicate her and put her all over Africa, we wouldn't even need to have this conversation. But she went and talked to the farmers, and if they said they needed roads, or they needed drying stations, or they needed something else, she got it done. So until we have more people who are willing to step up and do that, it's going to be a continued discussion.
I agree with whatever she's saying. We had Agnes in our program just before this, and one statement which she made was that if I want something, and God forbid something comes in my way, or someone who comes in my way after that. So she's a go-getter, and she did do it. Anyway, let me address last two questions because I think storage has been addressed. Let me put it this way. There's no mathematical formula. I can't tell you if the population is so much, so many should be farmers. It's just not possible. What is important and what will happen, the way we look at it is that farming should be remunerative. If farming is remunerative, people will gravitate towards it, take that as an occupation, and work on it. And there's nothing wrong in that. If you see from 1990s, many countries in East Asia, actually, they had a lot of movement from the rural to urban areas on the back of manufacturing and services. But during this time, the sub-Saharan nations and also South Asian countries, they missed out. They lagged behind in the industrialization and the services, and this is still lagging. So in the current setup, you can't expect sub-Saharan countries or the South Asian countries to really pull people out of the rural areas into very remunerative jobs in urban manufacturing or services sector. So what is the answer? The answer is to ensure that the rural communities using agro-industry as a conduit get linked to the increasing urban demand and really use that as an opportunity. So I will welcome if you read the SOFA 2017 report, which was discussed today morning, we'll discuss tomorrow morning. Read that. It's a really well-crafted report which talks about how the poverty and hunger which still plagues many countries in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, how that can now be tackled, and whether we need to do a track change from the earlier policies or how do we go about it. So there is no mathematical formula. About what is inside the farmer's head? Well, education, information, extension. Unless you provide this to the farmer, to expect an uneducated farmer to understand the intricacies of finance and market is next to impossible. So you have to give him information in a language which he understands. Definitely not the UN English. Even within the UN, we find it tough to understand at times. So you have to provide that knowledge and information in a simple, easy to understand language, and then handhold him till he or she is strong enough to take it from there. Make sure that the convoluted ideas in the head get straightened out. That's all I can say.
So I know Jim had a quick comment on that, and I can tell that Rob is taking notes, so he probably has a few comments. I know there were other questions. We're unfortunately running short on time, so I'll give it to you, Jim, and then to Rob and to Mutlatsi, and for some final comments. And for those of you who didn't get to ask your questions, hopefully our panelists will stick around either in the room or just outside and be able to answer some of those questions as well. So Jim.
So I want to comment on what's in a farmer's head, and I want to hear from Musi on this too, because when I visit my wife's village, I think it's absolutely idyllic. It's very quiet, it's calm, it's peaceful, it's a wonderful place. My cell phone doesn't work, everybody else's cell phone works, mine doesn't. I'm thinking, listen, I'm in heaven, right? And I said to my wife one day, it's like, why don't the young people want to stay out here? And she says, you are old. The reasons you like it here are the very reasons young people want to get the heck out, right? They want some excitement. They want some sex appeal out of their cropping systems, right? So, Musi, I would love to visit you and your village and your farm someday. So maybe you could comment on what's in a farmer's head. Fact-finding, hey.
Hopefully a more effective one.
Farmer's head is a lot of room for thinking. We're staying on a low-tone environment, and friends are all these other living organisms, including the pests. They are friends of ours. We don't want to kill them all. We only defend some of our food. Yeah. I want to come back to the issue of storage.
Yeah.
So I'm from a world-class country, South Africa. We do have silos. I have the right to store in those silos, but I have to pay. I was fortunate during 2010, whilst invited in Zambia, I happened to meet Dr. Prakash. There he is sitting. I don't know what's wrong with him. Dr. Prakash, what's up?
He's tweeting.
Oh, let's see. Right, during 2010, Dr. Prakash, you and I attended a conference in Zambia. They were talking Naktesa and Comesa, which would be helping us get produce throughout the border gates in the continent. What happened to that plan? Can you answer that? Oh, you're growing. You're aging now. You and I, Dr. Prakash, were in Zambia. Yes. And they were talking Naktesa, Comesa, to say the opening up for trade of our produce. And they were involving regulators who are now out of parliaments today. They are on pension. But the system, what happened? Is it still ongoing?
There has not been much progress, specifically as Zambia is concerned. Zambia put together really a very restrictive regulation on not just the commercialization of GMO or the testing, but even on the laboratory research. We were involved in helping set up cooperatively the lab at the University of Zambia, but even to import the plastic was impossible and still is. So that's one of the fallback on the unfortunate sector of how regulatory regimes around Africa and Asia evolved, mostly due to European help, I should add, and many of them still stay that way.
Did you hear that? It comes back to regulation. Deregulate, please.
So just a quick couple comments on this issue of the future of agriculture and what it's going to look like. An organization like USAID invests in agriculture because it's the most effective way of reducing extreme poverty and undernutrition, which we measure by child stunting. So it's very much about human outcomes. But the beauty of that is it's not just the farmers that's benefiting. Consumers actually benefit more. And the spillovers of agricultural growth into the local economy develops opportunities for poor people, goods and services, being a barber, repairing equipment, delivering poultry to chicks to farmers, all kinds of things open up. So this kind of growth is very, very attractive to a development investor like USAID. So that agricultural transformation, it's going to be a dynamic process, and probably fewer people will farm in the future, but that's because they'll have better opportunities. The ones that are staying on the farm will have better opportunities there, but others will find them in other parts of the economy which grow because of the growth coming out of agriculture. And then finally, on this issue of regulation and policy, we talked about different kinds. Country ownership is key. Why do I think the law passed in Uganda? Because the National Agricultural Research Organization in Uganda has been a leader in Africa in developing the technologies that it wanted to deliver to Uganda's farmers. That is seen, it's their decision about their future. So that kind of ownership, we can help in terms of science-based approaches and best practices. I mean, the same thing is true with trade policy or farm policy. We mentioned Agnes Kalibata and how Julie mentioned her and how incredibly responsive she was. So that really matters. You know, we really can't do this. It's got to be a partnership. We can only do it if we really have partners with the countries we're working with.
Great. Well, I'd now like to welcome up Howard Minig, who is the president and CEO of CropLife International, and he's going to give us a few closing remarks to finish us out.
Thanks very much to our panelists for this insightful discussion on how innovations can improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. It's been very heartening to hear that from a very diverse panel of experts. They've come to several common conclusions and approaches to improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. The incidence of poverty is greatest in the farming sector, and we have about 1.5 billion smallholder farmers on the planet. If we're going to really achieve our goal of making a dramatic reduction in the incidence of poverty, then we need to understand and address the needs of these smallholder farmers. And we've all seen models that work. The panel has talked about various parts that are necessary of working models that will address the needs of smallholder farmers. They need education, they need information, they need access to knowledge, either by farmer to farmer or through technology and external training programs. They need access to resources, they need access to capital, they need access to quality inputs to increase yields and production, but that's not sufficient. They also need access to markets so that they can monetize some of the labor that they have invested, and then their standard of living starts to increase. They can send their children to school as opposed to working endlessly in the fields. And that's the way that we break this vicious cycle of poverty being handed down from generation to generation. So one of the things that I would ask all of you, many of us are involved in reaching out to various segments of smallholders to help them with parts of their needs. What we need to do is to broaden our collaborations so that we can offer a more holistic and comprehensive list of needs that they have so that more smallholders can successfully navigate this road out of poverty. We're out of time, so please join me in a round of applause and thanks for our panelists. Thanks to DevEx for partnering with CropLife to make this event possible. And thanks to you, the audience, both in the room as well as online, for your active participation. I think the most appropriate close to this session would be to recall the words of the person whose life and work we are celebrating here at the World Food Prize. So I will leave you with the thought that innovation in agriculture can make a huge difference, but only when we take it to the farmer. Thank you very much.